Some truths are not written to be read, they are written to be remembered. Tonight's mystery begins not with a murder, but with an ink-stained glove, a fading manuscript and two lives entangled by ambition more potent than poison. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Step quietly now, for what we uncover was meant to remain hidden in the margins. It was one of those sullen mornings peculiar to London in early November, when the fog hovers low like a stained muslin veil, muffling every sound and turning gaslight into a ghostly bloom. The fire at Baker Street had grown thin by the time Holmes rose from his violin and cast it aside with absent interest. I had just taken to a volume of Swinburne when our morning post was interrupted, not by the postman, but by a sharp rapping at the door. Urgent, yet unsure, as though the hand that delivered it had second thoughts even while it struck. Mrs. Hudson appeared but a moment later, ushering in a figure who seemed, to my eye, altogether swallowed by the mist outside. He was a young man, narrow in shoulder and long of limb, with features that might have been handsome were it not for the haunted tension about the mouth and the unmistakable pallor of sleeplessness. He clutched his hat tightly to his chest, as if fearing its escape. Holmes, without rising, observed him silently, and I could sense in the tightening of his brow that some early impression had already formed. "I hope I am not intruding," the young man began, his voice steadier than his hands. "My name is Hugh Allerton. I was, until quite recently, the literary assistant to Mr. Octavius Greer." Holmes inclined his head only slightly, inviting continuation. The name, I knew, needed no introduction. Greer was a historian of some eccentric renown, author of Shadows upon the Sceptre and Chronicles of the Forgotten. Reclusive by nature, he had made few public appearances in recent years, yet his written voice remained potent in the journals and halls of scholarship. "I have come to you because Mr. Greer has died," Allerton said after a moment's hesitation. "2 days ago he was found in his study, the door locked from within, no sign of struggle, his pen fallen beside him." "A natural death?" I asked. "So they say," replied the young man, "though nothing about that room, or what I found there, felt natural to me." Allerton sat forward now, his fingers tightening unconsciously around the brim of his hat. "They claim it was suicide," he said. "The doctor noted a vial of laudanum on the desk. He must have taken it during the night. The coroner signed without protest." Holmes said nothing, his gaze now fixed on the young man's coat sleeve. "But it was what lay beside him that I cannot explain," Allerton continued. "Not a note, nor a farewell, but a single glove. Small, pale, and, strangest of all, stained with ink, violet ink, and only on the inside." "The inside?" I repeated. "Yes, as though it had been removed hastily while still wet. The stain soaked through the lining, not the surface." Holmes finally stirred. "And the glove? To whom did it belong?" "I cannot say," said Allerton. "It did not match any of Greer's, nor mine, nor Miss Clara's, his niece. No one has claimed it. And yet, it was placed deliberately beside the manuscript, as if it held meaning." Holmes steepled his fingers, the familiar shadow of concentration passing over his face like a cloud over water. "Mr. Allerton," he said slowly, "you say the ink was violet. Was that the colour typically used by Mr. Greer?" "Yes, he corrected his proofs in violet, a peculiar habit of his. I often fetched the bottles from Pender's stationers in Bloomsbury." "And did you observe this glove before anyone else entered the study?" Allerton nodded. "I was the one who found him. The maid had knocked and received no reply. I broke open the door myself." Holmes's eyes drifted to the young man's sleeve and then to his fingers. "May I ask, Mr. Allerton, do you often write in ink yourself?" I do. I sometimes draft his dictations by hand before typing." Holmes leaned forward, plucked a handkerchief from the side table, and reached silently to press it against Allerton's left cuff. A faint bloom of violet revealed itself at once. Allerton paled. "I spilled some ink last night," he stammered. "It was nothing." "Nothing," Holmes murmured, "can be a most eloquent thing." There was a curious duality in Mr. Allerton's manner that I found increasingly difficult to reconcile. At moments he appeared overcome, his voice trembling, his posture limp with despair. Yet at others he answered with practiced calm, his gaze steady and detached. As Holmes shifted his attention to the fire once more, I studied the young man's profile and wondered what lay beneath that pale forehead and those heavy-lidded eyes. "Did Mr. Greer ever threaten to harm himself?" I asked gently. Allerton hesitated. "He was distant of late, distracted. He spoke often of legacy." Holmes interjected. "Legacy in which he starred alone, or one in which you shared a role?" The colour rose in Allerton's cheeks, not unlike the faint blush of ink that stained his sleeve. He had promised to name me as co-author of his next volume, a symbolic gesture, perhaps, but one of consequence, Holmes finished. Symbolism can be most practical, especially in wills. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and the faint ticking of the clock. Allerton shifted once more in his chair, his hands no longer gripping the hat, but each other. Holmes stood and walked to the window, peering out at the fog that still lingered like a veil drawn between the city and the truth. "A glove, ink, a legacy rewritten," he said, almost to himself. "Mr. Allerton, do you possess the glove in question?" "Yes," the young man replied, rising and drawing a small box from the inner pocket of his coat. He placed it carefully on the table and opened it. Inside lay a single glove of ivory kid leather, dainty, feminine, and unmistakably marred by a blot of violet ink that had soaked deep into the lining. Holmes did not touch it, but observed it with the care of a man reading an unfamiliar language. "You were right to bring this to me," he said finally, "and you are correct in suspecting that this death, though quiet, was not without its voice." Allerton looked up. "Then you will take the case?" Holmes turned to him. "Not for your sake, Mr. Allerton, but for the sake of truth, which, unlike ink, ought not to smudge." And with that, the matter was engaged. Our cab deposited us at the gate of the Greer estate shortly after noon, the fog having given way to a flat grey light that neither brightened nor faded. The house itself stood at the end of a long gravel drive, a brooding structure of stone and ivy, its windows dark and recessed like the eyes of a scholar too long buried in his books. We were met by a manservant whose expression bore the polished indifference of long service to eccentric minds. With no word beyond a deferential nod, he led us through a corridor lined with portraits of severe historical figures and into the room where Octavius Greer had lived and died. The study had not been touched. The dust on the spines of the books, the ash in the grate, the faintest trace of tobacco on the air, all spoke to an atmosphere suspended in time. The desk remained cluttered with papers and annotated volumes. The chair where Greer had last sat faced away from the light, and a coat hung still on its peg, as though awaiting a return that would never come. Holmes took one slow step inward and drew a breath so slight I scarcely caught it. Yet I knew from long habit that something in the stillness had already begun to speak to him. Greer's body had already been removed, of course, but the marks of his final position remained. A depression on the seat cushion, a few scattered sheets with handwriting trailing off mid-thought, and the faint imprint of an elbow on the blotter told of a man who had died not violently, but in silence, and perhaps solitude. Holmes moved to the desk and examined a small bottle with practiced care. It bore no label, but exhaled the familiar, bitter tang of laudanum. "Enough to dull the senses," he murmured, "or end them altogether." "A suicide, then?" I asked. "That is the narrative," he replied. "It is perhaps too still. Death, even peaceful death, is rarely so neat. It resists curation." I moved around the desk and glanced at the items Greer had left behind. A silver penholder, a copy of Plutarch's Lives, and a sheaf of foolscap upon which a sentence had been started and never concluded. The words, "but memory will not," were the last to have emerged from his pen. What followed was a tremor of ink and then a void. Holmes stood at the edge of the desk with his hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me, Watson," he said quietly, "do you smell anything beyond the laudanum?" "Only the paper and ink," I replied. He nodded. "Precisely. No candle, no scorched oil, no burnt wick. Yet the hearth was used. We shall revisit that." Holmes turned his attention to the blotting pad with the reverence of a man deciphering a half-erased confession. He lifted it carefully, holding it at various angles to the window's light, and then set it down with greater interest than he had shown to the vial of laudanum. "There," he said, "observe this smear. Oblong, trailing eastward, and faintly curved. Not the mark of a pen drawn away, but of a hand removed hastily." I leaned in to see more clearly. It was, indeed, a peculiar stain, not the neat mirror of an inked word, but a blot, smudged and indeterminate, its curve too sharp to match any known calligraphic gesture. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "It was made in haste," said Holmes, "but not by Greer. His hand, by all accounts, was steady to the end, and note the colour, violet." "Yes, we were told he preferred that hue." "Indeed," Holmes said, "but even preferences can become prisons, especially if someone else attempts to imitate them." I could not help but feel that a strange unease had settled upon the room, as though it remembered something it could not repeat. While Holmes remained fixed on the blotter, I wandered to the sideboard and discovered a small drawer half ajar. It was unlined and contained only a single object, a glove. I took it up carefully. It was delicate, made of pale leather, unmistakably feminine in cut and size. More curiously, the lining bore a blot of violet ink, concentrated at the base of the fingers. I held it up to Holmes. "Found apart from its pair," I said. He approached and examined it without touching. "Left hand," he noted, "and worn during writing or shortly after, but not by Greer." "Clara Greer?" I asked. He gave a slight frown. "Perhaps, but why would a lady leave only one glove? And why hide it in a drawer if there were nothing to fear?" I looked again at the stain inside. The mark was not chaotic. It had pooled in a pattern consistent with compression, as if someone had gripped something still wet. Holmes turned back to the desk. "One glove lost," he said, "is misfortune. One glove hidden is intention." The quiet knock on the study door signalled the return of the housemaid. Margaret, a woman of indeterminate age and evident nervous discipline, entered with hands folded before her apron. Holmes motioned for her to approach. "You were the first to knock upon the door that morning, were you not?" "Yes, sir." "And it was locked from within?" "As always, sir. Mr. Greer disliked interruption." "Was Miss Clara in the house at the time?" "She had gone out riding, returned shortly before Mr. Allerton called you." Holmes studied her closely. "Did Mr. Greer and his niece quarrel?" Margaret hesitated. Her eyes darted, not in fear, I thought, but calculation. "They disagreed often," she said. "He was a proud man. Miss Clara is not the sort to step quietly." "Over what did they disagree?" "Mostly his books, sir. She thought they were unkind to women." Holmes inclined his head slightly, and I recognised the subtle encouragement he employed when an interview had reached the cusp of revelation. "There was a time," Margaret added in a lower tone, "when she feared he might change the will." "Feared it?" Holmes asked. "She had no fortune of her own." Holmes said nothing more, but I could feel the air thicken with the weight of something unsaid. Margaret departed, and Holmes turned his attention once more to the desk. The manuscript Greer had been composing lay in 3 parts. The original draft, a marked-up version in violet ink, and a final clean copy in a leather folder sealed with a ribbon. I examined the last of these. "This version," I said, "bears the imprint of the publisher." Miss Clara had it sent that very afternoon, came a voice from the doorway. We turned to see Hugh Allerton, who had returned with a sheaf of correspondence. She now holds all literary rights under the probate grant. The solicitor confirmed it this morning. Yet this draft, Holmes said, indicating the violet corrections, was incomplete. She claims he gave her final instructions. And you believe her? Allerton hesitated. She is not sentimental, Dr. Watson, but she loved him in her way. Holmes remained silent for a moment. There is danger in stillness, he said at last. A room where nothing moved can conceal the hand that did. As we made to leave, Holmes paused at the threshold of the study, one hand resting lightly on the frame. His eyes lingered not on the desk or the hearth, but on the ink bottle, squat, unassuming, and capped with a slight chip on its rim. There are words, he said softly, that never wished to be finished, and some that were never meant to be read at all. He turned away, and we passed again through the corridor of watchful portraits, their eyes as silent as the secrets they guarded. Outside, the grey light had not shifted, the wind carried no birdsong, and though we stepped back into the living world, I felt the door to that study close behind us, not with a sound, but with a silence I have not forgotten. We were shown to the morning room, a chamber more elegant than inviting, its upholstery too stiff for comfort, its floral arrangements too deliberate to feel sincere. There we found Miss Clara Greer seated near the window, the pale light outlining the rigid silhouette of her morning attire. Her posture, her hands clasped loosely in her lap, and the measured tilt of her head gave the impression of composure so carefully arranged that it bordered on theatrical. She rose as we entered, offering a courteous nod, not curt, but neither warm. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said in a voice smooth and cool as pressed linen. "You are here about my uncle." "Indeed, Miss Greer," Holmes replied. "We hope to disturb you as little as possible." "I am already disturbed, Mr. Holmes," she said with the faintest suggestion of a smile. "But I have always preferred clarity over comfort. Do sit down." We did so. I studied her with quiet attention. She was not beautiful by conventional measure, but possessed that arresting refinement found in certain types of English women, born not of softness, but of will. There was intellect in the lines of her mouth and a touch of something harder behind the eyes. Not grief, not quite, but something adjacent to it. I could not say whether she meant to help us or to hinder us, but I felt at once that she would choose her words with precision, and her silences even more so. Holmes opened the exchange with a courteous inquiry about her relationship with the deceased. Clara's hands, still gloved in black, folded more tightly over one another. "My uncle was a man of great intellect," she said, "and a great many opinions. It was not always easy to remain in agreement with him." "In what manner did you disagree?" Holmes asked, his voice as unobtrusive as the ticking of the clock behind her. "On literary matters, primarily. I read his drafts. He welcomed criticism, but only of a certain kind. He disliked correction, particularly when it came to his female characters." "You found them inaccurate?" "I found them convenient," she replied. "They suffered nobly, or they betrayed melodramatically. Never once did they outreason their male counterparts. I told him as much." "And how did he receive such frankness?" Her gaze flickered, then steadied. "With civility, always, but also with silence." I observed her then with renewed curiosity. There was no tremor in her voice, no quivering of the lip or eye. If her grief existed, it was bound tightly in intellect and intention. Yet beneath the calm, I sensed something unresolved, a tension that did not belong solely to mourning, but perhaps to the memory of words once exchanged and never taken back. Holmes offered a small, non-committal smile. "You valued his mind, but you challenged it." "I did," she said, "because I respected it." Holmes let a moment pass in silence before speaking again. It has been suggested to us, Miss Greer, that your uncle intended to revise his will. Clara's eyes narrowed by a fraction. That may be so, she said. He made vague references to changes, but he never stated them plainly, nor did he consult me. Yet you are now the sole inheritor of his literary estate. Her reply came without delay. As far as the solicitor is aware, yes. Was there any indication, Holmes asked, that your uncle intended to disinherit you altogether? She hesitated. Not long enough to seem evasive, but just long enough for Holmes to mark it. He was displeased with certain decisions I made, she admitted. He disliked that I declined a suitor of his choosing. And he disliked even more that I gave notes on his work. But you remained in the house. He did not ask me to leave, and I did not offer to go. Holmes inclined his head gently. Then you remained in proximity to a man you both admired and resisted, who may or may not have been preparing to cut you from his future. Clara offered no rebuttal. She merely adjusted the cuff of her glove and turned her gaze once more to the grey morning beyond the window. The conversation turned to practical matters, correspondence with Greer's publisher, the location of the author's final notebooks, and Clara rose momentarily to retrieve a ledger from a writing cabinet in the corner. It was a simple act, unremarkable in itself, and yet I noticed that when she unlatched the cabinet and handled its contents, it was her left hand that performed the task with ease and precedence. Holmes, who had up to that point been idly adjusting the cuffs of his sleeve, fixed his gaze upon her hand with an almost imperceptible narrowing of the eyes. I too recalled the glove we had found, dainty, pale, ink-stained, and for the left hand. When Clara resumed her seat, Holmes's tone turned deliberately casual. You write with your left hand, Miss Greer? I do, she replied, almost surprised by the question. Always have. My uncle considered it a minor affliction of character. Holmes offered a faint smile, though his eyes did not echo the warmth. He was not alone in that prejudice. Left-handedness has been blamed for everything from poor penmanship to deviltry. Her lips curled slightly, but her gaze grew distant. The moment passed, but not for Holmes, and not for me. The ink-stained glove, the placement of the manuscript, the slant of Greer's corrections, all these suddenly seemed less fixed than before. The glove might indeed fit the hand, but the question now was whose guilt it covered. Clara excused herself to consult with the housekeeper on a matter of inventory. The instant the door had closed behind her, Holmes turned to the hearth. You noted the fire had been used recently, he said, yet no recent burnings were reported by the staff. I followed his gaze to the iron grate. The embers were long dead, but a thin residue of grey ash clung to the lower bricks, and within it the faintest glint of something more substantial. Holmes knelt, and using the tip of a brass poker, teased out several charred fragments. He laid them carefully on the stone hearth. One bore the ragged curve of a thumbed corner, and another, so blackened it flaked at the edge, revealed a half-legible word: revised. There was a page here, I said, from the manuscript, or from something meant to be kept apart from it, Holmes replied. Another fragment bore the scorched remnant of a red wax seal, Greer's by the look of it. Holmes held it nearer the light. A draft, perhaps, or a codicil. Among the ashes he also discovered a length of fabric, folded and partially melted. It was fine, pale, and bore a faint imprint of violet near its singed edge. A lining, Holmes murmured, from a glove. I felt a chill despite the hearth's heatless state. But only one glove was found. He looked up at me. Precisely. The silence pressed close around us. In the stillness of that room, it seemed the fire had not merely consumed paper and cloth. It had swallowed intention, testimony, perhaps even truth. When Clara returned, Holmes offered no hint of what had passed. He received her information with polite detachment, and we took our leave shortly thereafter. Outside, the air had cooled, and the trees in the courtyard whispered with an unsettling tremor. Hugh Allerton met us near the garden wall, as if awaiting our return. She did not tell you, did she? He said quickly, eyes darting between us. Tell us what? I asked. That the manuscript is not the one he dictated. I recognize some of the phrasing, yes, but the conclusion is different, entirely different. Holmes regarded him without expression. And you are certain? I wrote the notes myself. The original ending was darker, unresolved. But the new version casts me in rather flattering light. He never would have written it that way. You're implying it was altered. I'm stating it, and it wasn't by me. Holmes's gaze drifted past the young man, toward the tall windows of the house where Clara now moved in shadow. And if she did revise it, Holmes asked. Then she speaks with a voice that was not her own, Allerton replied. Holmes said nothing, but the weight of what he did not say hung heavy between us all. Back in the study, Holmes paused once more beside the hearth, the ash faint against the brick like echoes of vanished words. He stood for a long moment, staring not at what remained, but at what had been so precisely removed. There are silences, he said at last, that speak louder than any outcry. I did not press him. There was something in his bearing, a restrained gravity, that told me his thoughts had turned inward. The scene had not ended. It had simply shifted to a deeper layer of the play, where not all actors showed their faces. And so we left the fire to its ashes, and the silence to its secrets, for the moment. By Holmes's request, Miss Greer and Mr. Allerton rejoined us in the library, a sombre chamber whose tall glass-fronted shelves seemed to absorb rather than reflect the afternoon light. Holmes, with methodical calm, requested a brief handwritten note from each of them, no more than a paragraph, on the topic of their choosing. Clara penned hers without hesitation, the angle of her wrist and the measured flourish of her script betraying years of practiced refinement. Hugh Allerton, more self-conscious, submitted his contribution with a faint tremor of the pen, though his lines were neat and precise. Holmes then retrieved several letters known to have been written by Octavius Greer, as well as the final page of the contested manuscript. He laid all 6 sheets out across the long oak table in silence, his gaze moving slowly between them as he drew one lamp closer to illuminate the details. I watched him study the samples with a concentration that bordered on the hypnotic. He said nothing for several minutes, making small notes in his pocketbook, and occasionally pausing to examine the slant of a letter or the uneven stroke of a capital. At first glance, he murmured finally, one might observe remarkable consistency. But handwriting, like voice, bears its own betrayals. He directed me to observe the capital G's in Greer's letters, distinctly looped and narrow, as compared to the broader, open form that appeared in the disputed page. A small discrepancy, perhaps, but under Holmes's lens, it began to grow. As Holmes continued his analysis, I turned to the final page of the manuscript, my eye drawn to the line that at first seemed innocuous, a mere transition between scenes. Yet something about the lettering gave me pause. Holmes, I said, tapping gently on the paper, this portion here, it appears tampered with. He leaned over without a word. I gestured to a particular sentence. Within it, a name, originally written with a confident hand, had been thickly overwritten, the ink heavier, its shape less fluid. Beneath the correction, the ghost of another word lingered, its identity smothered but not erased. You are quite right, Watson, Holmes said. Note the hesitation in the curve of the pen, uncharacteristic for Greer. And see how the letters surrounding the name are rushed, as though written under duress or constraint. I squinted. It begins with an H. Holmes nodded slowly. Perhaps the original name was Hugh, then replaced. The implication is as clear as the concealment. And the motive? He did not answer, but I saw the tension tighten subtly across his jaw. What had begun as a case of mislaid inheritance was growing darker in the ink. Something had been altered, not only in the manuscript but in the roles its authors had played. Leaving the library, Holmes returned us to the late author's study, the same airless room in which the story had, in a sense, ceased to write itself. On the desk lay the small glass bottle of violet ink we had previously observed, a squat vessel with crust at its lip and a slow, viscous residue clinging to the inside. Holmes removed a second ink sample from his pocket, a swatch taken from the page of the revised manuscript, and placed it on the table beside the inkwell. From within his case, he withdrew a narrow glass pipette and a series of testing strips prepared with a chemical compound of his own devising, which he had employed once before in the matter of the Shadwell poisoner. A drop from the manuscript ink stained the first strip with a purplish hue tinged faintly with blue. The residue from Greer's bottle, however, marked the paper a purer violet, deeper, more saturated. Holmes said nothing for several seconds. Then, the formulation differs, not dramatically, but enough. The ink used in this manuscript came from a different bottle, I frowned, but both are violet. Indeed, yet the stationer's art allows for endless shades within a single term. A discerning writer selects his tint like a painter chooses his oils. Then whoever made the change did so using their own materials, Holmes finished, not the tools of the man they wished to imitate. He folded the strips and replaced them with a quiet finality that carried more weight than any accusation. We returned to the drawing room, where Holmes held the stained page aloft before the light. His expression remained composed, but there was a keenness in his posture I knew well, the coiling of the mind before it strikes. There is a subtle irony, he said, almost to himself, in the employment of violet ink for deception. It was Greer's signature, his mark of authorship, and yet here it becomes the very evidence of forgery. He turned to Allerton and Clara, both seated in strained silence. This passage, he said, tapping the sheet, was not written with Greer's pen, nor was it dipped in his ink. It mimics his style well enough, but not so well that it passes untested. Clara said nothing, but her eyes fixed sharply on the manuscript. Hugh's hands were folded in his lap, his gaze set downward. Holmes continued. The person who altered this document chose to imitate Greer's hand, but employed the violet used for his editorial markings, never his legal or final drafts. That alone speaks to familiarity, yes, but also to carelessness, or perhaps desperation. His tone was even, but the room had grown perceptibly colder. I glanced toward the hearth once more, and thought again of the pages that had gone up in smoke. The silence that followed Holmes' statement lingered like a suspended verdict. Clara remained composed, but there was a stillness to her now that struck me not as control, but as containment. Hugh, by contrast, fidgeted minutely, a shift of the knee, a tightening of the jaw, as if a clock were winding more swiftly within him. Holmes did not press the point. He simply folded the manuscript page, returned it to its folder, and placed it on the table with care. "I make no accusation," he said, almost lightly. "I merely observe the ink, and the ink does not lie." I watched him with mild incredulity. I had seen him pin murderers to their guilt with less evidence. Yet here he refrained, and it was not restraint born of uncertainty. Later, as we walked down the hall toward the back of the house, I spoke low. "You believe it was Clara?" "She knew the ink," he replied. "She knew the room, but whether she altered the page or only permitted its alteration remains to be seen. And Hugh? There is guilt there, but of what kind and what depth, I have not yet concluded." We passed the parlour door, half closed. I saw Margaret, the maid within, her eyes on us as we passed, quiet as a shadow, but not absent. Holmes's next request was as unassuming as it was precise. "Let us visit the laundry," he said to the butler. "I should like to see what remains of Mr. Greer's effects." facts. The man, long used to eccentric inquiries from literary visitors, complied with a minimum of comment. We were led to a small back room, warm and fragrant with starch and lavender. There, folded into neat stacks, were the garments of the late author, each labelled and pressed. Holmes moved quickly and quietly. "The gloves," he said. "Where are they kept?" A box was produced. Plain pine, no lock, and inside, pairs of worn gloves, some more frayed than others. He examined each with meticulous care. At last, he looked up. "The pair is incomplete," he said simply. We both knew what he meant. The left-hand glove, ink-stained and folded into a drawer, had no right-hand companion. The match should have been here, but was not. He turned to the butler. "Have any garments been discarded since Mr. Greer's death?" "Not a thread, sir. Miss Greer instructed that nothing be removed." Holmes gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "One glove appears," he murmured. "The other vanishes. Such asymmetries, Watson, are rarely innocent." We returned to the study in silence. Holmes moved once more to the window, his hands behind his back, eyes on the bare trees beyond. "The forgery is crude," he said quietly, "but the intention was not. Someone has tried to shape a legacy with ink, and someone else, perhaps the same, has tried to bury a truth with ash." He did not turn to me, nor speak further. The glass before him showed only his reflection, solitary, deliberate, and waiting. And I knew then that the real question still hung in the air, untouched, unwritten, but growing darker with every hour of silence. It was scarcely past 9 o'clock on the morning following our return from the Greer estate, when Mrs. Hudson appeared with a letter, unsealed, unmarked, and folded with an economy that suggested haste, if not secrecy. Holmes took it from the salver and held it up to the light before opening it. The paper was plain, without watermark. The ink was black, but of a lighter, more diluted tone than Greer had favoured. It bore no address, signature, or flourish. Only 7 neatly printed words. "You are looking in the wrong direction." Holmes read it twice, then passed it silently to me. "A warning?" I ventured. "A correction," Holmes replied, "and more valuable than the sender perhaps intended. The phrasing is curious. Note the absence of threat, the absence even of rebuke. Whoever wrote this does not seek to frighten us, only to redirect us." "To whom?" "That, my dear Watson," said Holmes, rising with quiet purpose, "we must now discover." He reached for his coat and gloves. "Bring your hat," he added. "We are going ink hunting." And with those words, we were swept once again into the narrowing corridors of motive and misdirection. We emerged into a fog thick enough to muffle even the hooves of the hansom cab that bore us eastward through Bloomsbury. Holmes gave the address to the driver with a flatness that suggested it had been recalled from long-standing memory rather than recent inquiry. Our destination was Pender's Stationers, a narrow-fronted shop tucked between a tobacconist and a neglected chapel, its leaded windows obscured by dust and sun-faded paper samples. Within, the scent of gum arabic, paper mould, and aged oak welcomed us like the breath of an ancient archive. Behind the counter stood a man whose spectacles had grown misty with the temperature's contrast. He blinked owlishly at our entrance, but offered no greeting. Holmes addressed him without ceremony. "You stock Hargreaves Violet No. 4, do you not?" The old man nodded. "Indeed, sir. Not much call for it nowadays. We keep only a few bottles. I require the name of your most recent purchaser." The man gave a shrug that bordered on a flinch. "I do not keep names." "Then describe the buyer." A long pause followed. Then, "Tall, not old, nervous fingers, had a stain already on his cuff." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. The air within the shop had grown colder, or so it seemed. "Can you recall how long ago this transaction took place?" Holmes asked. his voice low and without insistence. 3 days, perhaps 4, the stationer replied. He asked for the Hargreave by name. That's uncommon. Most ask only for Violet and take what I offer. But he knew the bottle, even mentioned the viscosity. Holmes nodded. Did he speak of writing? No, only said it was for editorial work. Seemed distracted. Left or right-handed? The old man hesitated. Left, I think. He reached across the counter awkwardly. Holmes gave the faintest sigh. You are certain it was a man? Oh, yes, sir. A young gentleman. He wore a wool coat. Ink on the cuff. Bit pale. The description, so precisely aligned with our previous observations, settled in the room like a weight. I looked to Holmes, who remained impassive, though I recognized the minute tightening at the corners of his mouth, the only visible register of what, to him, must have felt like confirmation. The customer had been a man, not Clara, and the ink, Hargreaves' Violet No. 4, was no longer the province of the deceased alone. Back on the pavement, as we resumed our walk along the mist-draped street, I found myself unable to hold my tongue. You see what this implies, Holmes? The man in question, it can only be Allerton. Just so. But he claimed no knowledge of the ink, denied any part in its purchase. He did. And now we know that to be a lie. Then the forgery was not a feminine hand at all, Holmes finished, but one carefully trained to appear as such. I was silent for a moment, struck by the bitter elegance of the deception. You suspected him. I suspected both, Holmes replied. And I still do, but not for the same crime. Then Clara may still be guilty, but not, I believe, of what the glove suggests. We reached the corner of Russell Square, the gaslight struggling to burn clean in the murk. Allerton's stain was not merely chemical, Watson, Holmes said softly. It was psychological. Ink on the cuff is easily explained. But ink upon the conscience, that leaves a trace not so easily scrubbed away. We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes took once more to his armchair, fingers steepled, gaze fixed upon the fire. After a time, he spoke with the measured tone of one laying down the architecture of a hypothesis. The glove, Watson, has troubled me from the start. Too conveniently discovered, too oddly stained. And why only one? You believe it was planted. I believe it was staged. But by whom? By one who understood the grammar of guilt and how to make a scene speak a name not its own. Clara? No, Holmes said. Hugh. I stared. But what purpose? Distraction, Holmes replied. The glove suggests a woman's presence, a woman's haste, ink inside the lining, as though removed hastily after touching a wet pen. But Allerton knew Clara was left-handed. And what did we find burned in the hearth? Another glove, a right-hand glove, not its pair. The silence between us deepened. The fire crackled, throwing odd shadows across the room. Allerton, Holmes said, knew that suspicion clings most readily to those who have motive and opportunity. He supplied Clara both, and then supplied the glove. Holmes rose and crossed to his desk, retrieving the final chapter of Greer's manuscript, the one so heavily disputed in tone and purpose. I have reviewed the language, Watson. Greer's style was erudite, but never sentimental. Yet this final passage, he flipped open the pages, tapping a line, refers to the assistant character as the quiet architect behind the legacy. I frowned. That sounds like praise. Precisely. Praise not earned, but inscribed, and inserted, I believe, by the very man who now claims to mourn the truth. You mean to say Allerton authored it? Authored himself into it, Holmes corrected, as if to ensure that even in Greer's absence, he should not vanish with the rest of the footnotes. And the ink, identical to the bottle purchased days before Greer's death, a detail so damning that only hubris could have ignored it. I sank back into my chair. So the forgery was a monument to vanity, and a bid for immortality. Holmes closed the manuscript and laid it flat. But the ink, he murmured. Spoke too loudly. The lamplight in our sitting room had dimmed by degrees, as if recoiling from what had just passed between us. Holmes remained still, eyes on the page, his voice low. If Greer had truly meant to disinherit them both, he said, then Allerton's only path to remembrance lay not through law or blood, but through ink. He did not look up. And so, he added, he wrote himself a legacy. It was late afternoon when Hugh Allerton arrived at Baker Street in response to Holmes' terse summons. The fog outside had thinned to a bitter drizzle, and the young man entered our rooms with that air of resignation peculiar to those who know their fate may already be sealed. His boots were speckled with mud, his overcoat carelessly buttoned, and though he attempted a veneer of composure, I noted the nervous tapping of his fingers against the brim of his hat. Holmes did not rise. He remained in his chair, elbows resting lightly upon the arms, fingertips pressed together in the attitude of a man who requires no more answers, only the pleasure of revealing them. You know why I've asked you here, Holmes said without preamble. I can guess, Allerton murmured. The manuscript, among other things. The fire crackled in the hearth, but offered no warmth to the conversation. Holmes gestured to the table beside him, where lay the final chapter of Kingdom and Ashes, a violet-stained glove, and a folded letter. Mr. Allerton, Holmes continued, you purchased Hargreaves' violet No. 4 ink 3 days prior to Mr. Greer's death. You used it to alter the final chapter of his manuscript, inserting yourself into the text as co-author. The glove, the ink, the overwritten name, each speaks clearly. Allerton said nothing. He looked down at the floor, and when he raised his eyes again, they were not defiant, but hollow. Holmes leaned forward. The time for invention has passed. Let us now speak of what truly occurred. For a moment, Allerton did not reply. The silence thickened about us, not uncomfortable, but heavy with inevitability. Then, in a voice curiously devoid of bitterness, he said, You are correct, Mr. Holmes. I altered the manuscript. His confession was not theatrical, nor even particularly regretful. It was spoken as one might admit to an overdue debt. He reached for the manuscript as though to reclaim it, but Holmes placed a hand lightly over the cover. I did not intend to deceive entirely, Allerton continued. The final chapter was dictated to me, at least in part, but Greer was failing. His mind wandered. He left so much unsaid. And you chose to complete it? Holmes asked quietly. Yes, I knew his style, his thoughts. I believed I could honour him, but I also... He stopped and swallowed hard. I wish to be remembered. Holmes's face remained unreadable. You saw the will? I overheard him speak of it, that he meant to leave his works to some academic fund, not to Clara, not to me. I had given him years of my life, Mr. Holmes, and I knew once he died, I would vanish entirely. And so you forged yourself into history. Allerton met Holmes's gaze. He was dying anyway. I merely added the punctuation. Holmes did not respond, but I, watching them both, felt the unease of a man who realizes that crime, at times, can wear the robes of homage. Holmes stood slowly and crossed to the mantelpiece, where the ink-stained glove rested beside a bowl of white ash, retrieved from Greer's study. He picked it up, turning it thoughtfully in his hands. You believed this belonged to Miss Greer, he said. You saw it, stained and feminine, and assumed it was evidence of her guilt. It was in the drawer, Allerton said, and she is left-handed. As are you. Allerton blinked. Holmes turned. But no, the glove is not Clara's. It belonged to Margaret. The maid? Allerton's voice cracked. Holmes nodded. The embroidery on the inside seam bears the faint remnants of an M. Barely legible now, but present nonetheless. Moreover, she uses violet ink in the morning when logging expenses. I saw the bottle myself by the kitchen ledger. Allerton sat back heavily. I believe Margaret knew more of Greer's affairs than she ever let on, Holmes continued. She may even have found the will, and when she saw what he intended to do with his estate, she may have acted. Allerton was silent. She did not forge the manuscript, Holmes added, but she may have ensured you would. And I believed it was Clara. A convenient assumption, but not a true one. The fire hissed quietly in the grate. Holmes laid the glove back on the mantel, as though returning a truth no longer needed. He did not speak further, nor did Hugh Allerton, whose face had gone pale as the ash he had mistaken for honour. Holmes returned to his seat with unhurried precision, folding one leg over the other, as if the remainder of the narrative required only steady exposition to reach its grim conclusion. Hugh sat opposite, hands clenched, colour drained, not by fear, but by the dawning comprehension that he had been a participant in a tale far more complex than the one he thought himself to have authored. "There is more, Mr. Allerton," Holmes began, his tone grave, "than your forgery. You have been misled, perhaps subtly, perhaps willingly, into believing yourself the chief actor in a drama whose script was not wholly your own." He lifted the folded will from the table, now visibly creased and smudged. "This document, I believe, once existed in another form. A final version that named no family, no protégé, no romanticized successor. It favoured an academic trust to which Greer intended to donate his life's work. Cold, impersonal, principled. Margaret found it," Holmes continued, "in the drawer where she tidied his correspondence. She had long served him, not merely as housemaid, but as quiet companion, perhaps even confidant. In her eyes, no foundation nor institution had earned the fruits of his labour as she had." Allerton opened his mouth to protest, but Holmes raised a hand. She had no legal claim, but she did possess access to his teacup, to his routine, to his moments of solitude, and when the opportunity arose, she seized it. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "She did not kill him to save you. She let you write because she knew you would not stop." Allerton's breathing had become shallow, whether from shame or realization, I could not say. "She gave him the laudanum?" I asked softly. Holmes inclined his head. "A modest quantity, dissolved in his nightly tea, not enough to betray itself by odour, but sufficient when taken in his weakened state. The signs of decay had already begun. The tremor, the fatigue, the long pauses in dictation. She merely hastened what nature had started." "And when she found him dead?" "She said nothing," Holmes replied. "Not to Clara, not to you. But she left the door locked and waited for discovery. She had reason to believe you would find him, and that you would interpret his silence as invitation." Holmes turned again to Allerton. "And you did, didn't you? You took up the pen, not merely to finish his thoughts, but to elevate yourself within them." Allerton nodded barely. "I believed he'd meant it, that the ending was a gift." "A convenient belief," Holmes said. "One that spared you the need to question too closely how he had died." The young man sagged in his chair, as if the last veneer of defence had dissolved. Holmes's voice was now softer, but no less precise. "Margaret supplied the means. You supplied the legacy. Neither of you spoke of it, and thus a pact was formed, not by design, but by silence, one that served both your ambitions, until, inevitably, the ink bled through the page. For a moment, no one spoke. The fire in the grate had died to a faint orange core, and in the dim light of our sitting room, the faces of both men seemed etched in opposing species of defeat, one resigned, the other awakening to guilt belatedly understood. Holmes rose and walked to the window. He looked not outward, but at the dim reflection cast by the glass. "You are both culpable," he said at last, his voice without warmth. "One for extinguishing a life, the other for disfiguring what remained of it. Greer is dead, and his legacy is now built upon a forgery, not of paper, but of intent. He turned, slowly, and regarded Allerton. I shall inform Inspector Lestrade. The facts, as I have found them, will be his to interpret. Whether Margaret acted with premeditation or desperate loyalty, and whether your manuscript constitutes fraud in the legal sense, is no longer my concern. Allerton rose, with the air of a man given no answer but the one he already feared. He did not ask for mercy, nor attempt to argue the weight of his motives. There was, I believe, nothing left to argue. Holmes gestured toward the door. You may go. And with a last glance toward the stained glove upon the mantel, Hugh Allerton stepped into the corridor and was gone. I watched him vanish into the dusk, then turned to Holmes and said, "Was that justice?" Holmes did not reply. He simply stared at the dying embers and whispered, "Some legacies are written in blood, others in ink." The fog had thickened by the time we left the Greer affair behind us. It clung to the streets like wet muslin and distorted the gas lamps into shrouded halos, their glow too feeble to cut through the dusk. Our cab rattled eastward toward Baker Street in brooding silence. Holmes spoke not a word, his hat tilted forward, his gaze fixed on some inner image I could not see. I made no attempt to break the spell. I had seen that expression before, after the matter of the Three Gables, and again following the Milverton affair. It was the look of a man who had solved the puzzle, but found no satisfaction in the shape it revealed. Even I, who have witnessed crimes of all kinds, felt within me a peculiar distaste. This had not been a tale of passion nor malice, but something quieter and more corrosive, ambition cloaked in reverence, and affection curdled into possessiveness. By the time we reached our lodgings, the lamps in Baker Street glowed like watchful eyes. We ascended the stairs and returned to our familiar sitting room, where the fire still held some of its earlier warmth. Holmes removed his gloves and placed them with slow precision upon the mantel. Then he sat. The clock ticked, the fog lingered, and the air between us remained heavy with unspoken conclusions. I busied myself with the tray, pouring out a measure of the black Darjeeling we both favoured in colder months. It had grown slightly oversteeped in our absence, the flavour darker and more bitter than I would have liked, though I did not remark upon it. Holmes accepted his cup absently, holding it in his long fingers but not drinking. I stirred mine once, then said, "There is something about this case that unsettles me more than murder." Holmes did not reply, but I continued. There was no hatred, no blood, no threat, merely adjustments, a rephrased paragraph, a shifted inheritance, a tea laced with sleep instead of alarm, and yet the consequences were no less final. Holmes's eyes did not lift from the fire, but I knew he was listening. "Greed I can understand," I said, "even jealousy when it burns bright. But what do we make of ambition that masks itself in homage, or of loyalty that poisons to preserve?" Their motives, I added quietly, were literary, almost, less human than tragic. Holmes turned his head slightly. "Literature has furnished more graveyards than greed ever has, Watson, because it grants its authors justification." He took a sip of the darkened tea and said no more. Holmes leaned back into his chair, his gaze fixed on the hearth, as though the coals might rearrange themselves into legible answers. The light played across his features, deepening the hollows beneath his eyes, lending his countenance a lean sharpness that seemed more sculpted than living. "There is," he said at length, "nothing more dangerous than a man who believes he deserves to be remembered." I glanced up from my cup. "More dangerous than one who seeks power or wealth?" "Yes," Holmes replied, "because the man who desires power may be checked by consequence, and the man who desires wealth may be satisfied by possession. But the man who wishes to be remembered, he will write his name upon stone, upon flesh, or upon the legacy of others, and he will not care who must be erased to make room for it." He stood and took a few slow steps toward the desk. Greer was already fading, he murmured, and so Allerton wrote himself into the author's final breath. Margaret, whose presence would not have survived his obituary, ensured her absence would echo louder than her name. A man who kills out of fear, Holmes added, may be pitied, but a man who edits the truth must be understood to the last punctuation. Holmes reached into the inner drawer of the desk, the one I had long come to think of as his reliquary of unresolved burdens. He placed the violet-stained glove inside it without ceremony, letting it rest among other peculiar artifacts of our past cases. An ivory domino with a bloodstain at its edge, a child's brooch crusted with salt, and a broken lens from a monocle once belonging to a financier who had buried his secrets in a garden. He closed the drawer softly. It belongs there, he said, not as evidence, but as reminder. I said nothing. The glove had carried with it the weight of accusation, misdirection, and ultimately confession. Yet it had touched no weapon, concealed no poison, and whispered only in ink. Holmes remained by the desk, his posture that of a man in repose, though his mind was doubtless still moving across the chessboard of events. I wondered what he saw when he considered that drawer, not merely the objects, but the patterns that had brought them to rest there. Solved cases, yes, but never cleanly. Always some residue, some trace left behind. It was never the murder weapon that haunted Holmes. It was always the thing too small to kill, yet too telling to forget. For a long time, Holmes did not speak. He sat with his hands folded, eyes fixed not on any object, but on the abstraction of thought itself. I had seen him in this mood before, a mood that followed cases where no villain could be measured by scale, and no justice applied without smudging the line between consequence and confession. I resisted the urge to prod him with a question. There are certain silences in Holmes's company that deserve to be preserved, not broken. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels muffled by the wet stones. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and was silent. Holmes finally looked toward the fire, which had diminished to a steady orange glow, like the pulse of a patient barely breathing. There are facts, he said, almost to himself, and then there are truths. He said nothing further, and I understood that in this instance the difference mattered more to him than the outcome. As the hour turned and the room settled into its final hush, Holmes stirred from his reverie. He rose slowly and moved to the hearth, standing before the dying fire, as one might stand before a tombstone. His voice, when it came, was low, but not uncertain. In the end, he said, it was not the glove that betrayed the killer. He paused, letting the words rest for a moment. But the ink that stained a conscience. I watched him in silence. The glove had dried, the pages would yellow, the will would be contested. And yet none of those things mattered as much as the mark left within. Outside, the fog still clung to the glass. Time would pass. Names would fade. But the trace would remain. Quiet, irreversible, and written not in blood, but in the indelible colour of human vanity. Holmes turned away from the hearth, but did not return to his chair, and for the rest of that evening he said nothing more. As the fire in our hearth dimmed into orange cinders, Holmes remained in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, the ink-stained glove now resting amid his curiosities. "It is a peculiar thing, Watson," he murmured, "how the thirst to be remembered can drive a man to rewrite not only a manuscript, but a death itself. Ink may dry swiftly, yet ambition bleeds slowly through the paper of one's conscience." I studied him, sensing the weight this case had left behind. Holmes did not smile. He merely gazed into the fading light, as if tracing a truth too delicate to speak aloud. "What do you believe stained Hugh's soul more deeply? Margaret's secret act of murder, or his own decision to quietly profit from it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed unravelling this mystery, do consider liking the story, subscribing for more Holmesian investigations, and sharing it with a fellow lover of the strange and deductive.